Hey, what's going on, guys? UFC 300 is rapidly approaching and we still do not have a main event. So I'm going to go through all the potential options to headline UFC 300, from expected title fights to wildly unexpected matchups that could headline UFC 300. I'm going to give my opinion at the end of the video on what I believe will headline UFC 300, which really isn't that far away. It's about 4.5, 5 months away. It is tentatively set for early April, which would most likely be either April 6th or April 13th. Now, let's go through every UFC champion and talk about some potential options for the headliner of UFC 300. Right off the jump, you can eliminate all the women's champions. Weili Zhang is most likely taking on Yan Xiaonan in her next fight. It's not going to be the main event of UFC 300. Then you have Alexa Grasso most likely taking on Valentina Shevchenko in a trilogy in her next fight. It's not going to be the headliner of UFC 300. Could both of those fights be on UFC 300? It's possible, but it's not going to be the headliner. And lastly, you have the women's bantamweight division. You have a vacant title right now at UFC 297, January 20th. You're getting Mayra Bueno Silva versus Raquel Pennington for the bantamweight title. Is the winner of that fight going to headline UFC 300? Highly, highly unlikely. Then you get to the men's flyweight division. You have Alexandre Pantoja versus Brandon Royval 2, which is the co-main event of UFC 296 on December 16th. Could the winner of that fight be on UFC 300? It's possible. Are they going to headline? Absolutely not. That's not the caliber of main event the UFC is looking to put on for UFC 300. You have the bantamweight division. You have Sean O'Malley versus Marlon Chito Vera 2, which is headlining UFC 299 on March 9th. They're not going to make a quick turnaround and headline UFC 300, but we'll come back to this fight. I want to talk about this fight a little bit. Then you have the featherweight division, Alexander Volkanovski versus Ilia Topuria, which is headlining UFC 298 on February 17th. They're not going to make that quick of a turnaround and fight at UFC 300. Then you have the lightweight division. Islam Makhachev is currently unbooked. Would he be a suitable headliner for UFC 300? Yes, but it's highly unlikely that Islam Makhachev fights on 300. You have the welterweight division, which is a solid option because you have Leon Edwards versus Colby Covington main eventing UFC 296 on December 16th. The winner of that fight could defend their title at UFC 300. We'll come back to that. Then you have the middleweight division. You have Sean Strickland versus Dricus du Plessis fighting as the main event of UFC 297, which is on January 20th. Could they make a quick turnaround? Yes, they could. They could fight on UFC 300. That's a possible option. We'll talk about that more in a second. The light heavyweight division, you have Alex Pereira, who just won the belt at UFC 295 against Yuri Prochazka. Yes, he could easily make UFC 300 and be the headliner of UFC 300. So if you go through all the kind of options that I just gave you in terms of champions, you basically come down to, 4 or 5 realistic options. But I want to talk about Sean O'Malley for a second, because Sean O'Malley versus Marlon Vera is going down at UFC 299. It's the main event of that card, which is a month before UFC 300. So I said, that's not really likely, but there is a chance, because if the UFC is really scrambling and struggling to find a suitable main event for UFC 300, I could see the UFC moving some things around and finding a way to just move Sean O'Malley versus Marlon Vera as the main event of UFC 300. I could see them moving it from UFC 299 to UFC 300. Do I think that's super likely? No. But it is a possible option. Next up, you have Islam Makhachev, who is available. I don't believe he'll main event UFC 300. He has Ramadan going on. It's going to be the tail end of Ramadan. He's not going to be ready. He's not going to be, 100% because he hasn't been eating and whatnot. He's been fasting. And while the UFC could maybe convince him to headline UFC 300, I think it's highly unlikely. And I also believe, and I made an entire video on this, I believe Islam Makhachev's next title defense will be at the Saudi Arabia UFC Fight Night card on March 2nd. So if that happens, that completely rules out Islam Makhachev. Then you have the more realistic options. Leon Edwards versus Colby Covington winner. Who could they fight as the headliner for UFC 300? Well, if Colby Covington beats Leon Edwards, this is going to sound crazy, and you guys will have to let me know what you think down in the comments. I think Colby Covington versus Bilal Muhammad could be a UFC 300 headliner. I think when you look at Colby Covington and you look at Bilal Muhammad, they are kind of like alternate reality versions of each other, where Bilal Muhammad, actually fights contenders and, has a winning streak and is not, 2-2 in his last 4 fights. but they both have like cringy, kind of corny trash talk. And then you have multiple people who, like or hate both fighters, whether it's Colby Covington or Bilal. You have a fan base who either really likes them or really dislikes them. So I think when you combine those two fighters together, I think that would be a pretty big fight. I think Colby Covington versus Bilal Muhammad, if promoted correctly, would be a pretty big fight. Now, Leon Edwards versus Bilal Muhammad too could also be a headliner, but I don't know if the UFC's really, I don't know if that's the caliber of headliner that the UFC is really looking for. I don't think that is like the spectacle they would want for UFC 300, because it really wouldn't be a spectacle. But I do believe also the winner of Leon Edwards versus Colby Covington, if they fight Shavkat Rakhmonov, and let's say Shavkat, who fights at UFC 296 as well, let's say he gets a big win over Wonderboy Thompson, brutally KOs him in the first minute or something along those lines, I think the hype surrounding Shavkat could make for a big UFC 300 title fight. You could have Edwards versus Shavkat or Colby versus Shavkat. I think that could make a suitable UFC 300 main event as well. But that's still, no matter what, I don't think that's like the, this crazy eye-catching headliner that the UFC truly wants for 300. You move on to the middleweight division, Strickland versus DDP. The winner of that fight could headline 300. That's a quick turnaround to go from January 20th to potential April 6th. You're looking at a 3-month turnaround. The UFC's already tried that with Dricus du Plessis before, so I think that's highly unlikely. But if they do it, you could see the winner of Strickland versus DDP against Khamzat Chimaev as the UFC 300 headliner. I think the only reason the UFC's given Dricus du Plessis a title shot is because Khamzat's injured and they really needed a headliner for UFC 297. So they gave Dricus the title shot, even though Dricus does deserve the title shot. The UFC really wants to put Khamzat Chimaev in a title fight. They believe he can be a massive star for them. So it wouldn't shock me, especially if Strickland beats du Plessis. Strickland will make quick turnarounds. He'll fight late notice replacements. Strickland is willing to fight at all times. And if the UFC is willing to cut Strickland a massive paycheck, we could get Sean Strickland versus Khamzat Chimaev as the UFC 300 headliner. Another potential option that a lot of people probably aren't thinking about for UFC 300 is the winner of Sean Strickland versus Dricus du Plessis versus Israel Adesanya. That would be a ginormous fight, because if Dricus wins the title, you have Dricus versus Adesanya, which the whole backstory, the fans really kind of got involved with that, and who's more African, and this whole dumb storyline. But they have that backstory. They have that confrontation in the cage. This was a fight a lot of people were dead set on that never happened because Dricus du Plessis couldn't make a quick turnaround, and that would be a huge fight for UFC 300. But even if Strickland wins, Strickland versus Adesanya too is huge. There's a lot of people who believe Adesanya didn't really show up for that fight at UFC 293. He took Sean Strickland, he took him lightly. And then, on top of that, it seems like he wasn't really training as hard as he could have been. He's out drinking and driving. And the rematch and the potential implications for Adesanya's career in a rematch, I think that'd be massive for UFC 300. And I also think Strickland, if he can continue to win, because he's such an odd character and like a memorable fighter, I think he's going to build his star power up with a potential win against Dricus du Plessis. Then you get to the light heavyweight division, which you have Alex Pereira. He is kind of like, if you had to pick out one champ right now who could headline UFC 300, who's most likely, it's probably Alex Pereira. You could get Alex Pereira versus Jamal Hill to headline 300. That's not like this huge, massive fight, but it's a pretty big title fight. I mean, you have Jamal Hill, a champion who never lost his belt. He vacated it because of an injury, then since defended it against his brother, but he was already vacating it. And you had, Alex Pereira versus Yuri Prohaska for the vacant belt. And now Alex Pereira is a champion. He's a former middleweight champion. He has a lot of fans behind him because he's kind of coalesced his fan base around Israel Adesanya haters, which is very interesting. And I think if he keeps winning, I think Alex Pereira is going to become a big name in the sport. I think he's already kind of like a low tier kind of level of draw within the sport. And against Jamal Hill, I think that'd be an interesting kind of build up, because Alex Pereira has a very unique way of kind of talking trash and trolling a little bit. And then you have Jamal Hill, who gets bent out of shape about everything. And just, forget about that. I'm just talking about the UFC loves those types of storylines. It's a banger of a fight. I mean, who doesn't want to see that fight? That's an amazing matchup. So as long as Jamal Hill isn't in legal trouble, Alex Pereira versus Jamal Hill could be your UFC 300 headliner. But another wild card for Alex Pereira would be Alex Pereira versus Israel Adesanya 3 for the light heavyweight title. Don't be surprised if that comes out of nowhere, because Israel Adesanya said, I'm going to sit out for a couple years, and a lot of fans are eating it up. He doesn't mean that. I believe most likely Israel Adesanya will fight in 2024. Do I think it's going to be early 2024? I'm not really counting on that. I think he probably fights in late 2024. But it would not shock me if the UFC tried to make it worth his while to do Alex Pereira, Israel Adesanya 3 for the light heavyweight title. Adesanya has always said, I want to become 2-division champion. This is his opportunity. And the storyline there, the rivalry there, would be insanity. Imagine if Alex Pereira is able to avenge his loss at middleweight as the champion defending his belt at light heavyweight. And imagine if Israel Adesanya can kind of get his career back on track by winning a light heavyweight title against the guy who he just knocked out not that long ago, and literally 2 fights ago in his career, but not that long ago in terms of time either. So that could be a huge headliner for UFC 300, which would be Alex Pereira versus Israel Adesanya 3. Now, in terms of other kind of wild card matchups you could get for UFC 300, there's been a lot of talk of Ronda Rousey returning against Miesha Tate for UFC 300. Now, for those of you guys who I'm assuming is a lot of you who didn't experience the Ronda Rousey era, Ronda Rousey was, and this is a bit of an exaggeration, but she was like a Conor McGregor level draw, like a little bit below Conor, but that's how big Ronda Rousey was in the sport. She was a star. She was selling 1 million pay-per-view buys. The UFC undoubtedly would try to lure her back, but I don't think she would fight Miesha Tate. I don't think she's going to come back to try to beat up a washed up Miesha Tate who she already has 2 wins over. I think if Ronda Rousey returns, and I'm going to go in this list in order of least likely to most likely in terms of this kind of, wild card matchups. I'm not including the title fights that I just went over, but I'll give my final opinion at the end of the video. I think if Ronda Rousey returns, it'll most likely be a title fight. So you'll get Ronda Rousey versus the winner of Mayra Bueno Silva versus Raquel Pennington. It would not shock me. Now, I think that's the least likely of all these wild card options I'm going to go through. But if she's going to return, she's not going to want to fight Miesha Tate, who she has 2 wins over, who Miesha Tate's on the back end of her career, because it does nothing for her. And if she loses, she's going to be petty for the rest of her life, and she's going to be kicking herself for the rest of her life because she really doesn't like Miesha Tate. She'd rather return and attempt to fight for a belt. And to be honest, the women's bantamweight division hasn't evolved that much. It's not that much more highly skilled since she left. So, it's sad to say, but Ronda could probably compete in the women's bantamweight division today. So that could be your headliner, Ronda Rousey versus the winner of the title fight at UFC 297. The next wild card, and this one's super unlikely as well, but that would be George St. Pierre versus Conor McGregor. I know that sounds crazy, but if you look at the current landscape, the UFC has kind of hinted at, in the past, they want to bring GSP back out of retirement. GSP was a massive draw in the UFC. In case you missed the era of GSP, he was selling a lot of pay-per-view buys. He wasn't as big as Ronda. He wasn't as big as Conor, but he was selling a lot of pay-per-view buys. And he always wanted that Conor McGregor fight. He always wanted the Khabib fight. If you remember, I believe GSP went to UFC 229, and there was a lot of talk that if Conor beat Khabib, we were going to get GSP versus Conor McGregor. So that's a fight that the UFC's kind of flirted with in the past. Conor McGregor's coming back from a horrific leg break. He's not really showed a whole lot of interest in fighting Michael Chandler, who's been brown-nosing him for 2 years and wants to take him into the NBA Finals restroom. And I could totally see the UFC saying, you know what, we're going to deviate from that plan. The Ultimate Fighter ratings were garbage. Conor doesn't really want it. Let's book him against GSP because GSP is a massive name in the sport. His return would be huge. And also, it's one of those fights where nobody really loses any stock. Even if GSP were to ragdoll McGregor and McGregor loses, it's not like McGregor really, it's not like his stock suffers a lot. Where if McGregor comes back, he's already lost his last 2 against Dustin Poirier, doesn't have a decent win since 2016. If he goes out there and gets brutally chinned by Michael Chandler, his stock is going to plummet and his star power is going to diminish. Where if he fights GSP, he's only raising his star power, whether he wins or loses. So that's a potential option. The next potential option is a non-title middleweight matchup between Israel Adesanya and Khamzat Chimaev. This would be a massive fight. This is a fight that a lot of fans have wanted to see for a while, and it just seems like whatever Khamzat Chimaev fight fans are really looking forward to, It just doesn't happen. Me and a lot of fans were looking forward to Kamaru Usman, Khamzat Chimaev. It never happened. Khamzat moves up to middleweight. We're like, oh, Israel Adesanya versus Khamzat Chimaev would be amazing. Israel loses the belt, and then Khamzat Chimaev fights Usman on short notice and gets injured. And, it's a fight that a lot of fans want to see. Israel Adesanya has a lot of star power. Khamzat Chimaev has a lot of star power. They could make that a #1 contender fight for the middleweight division. Or let's say the UFC says, Strickland or Duplessis, we want you to turn around and fight one of the fights I mentioned earlier against Adesanya or Khamzat. And they say, no, we can't make a turnaround. Don't be shocked if the UFC says, you know what? We'll do Adesanya versus Chimaev for an interim middleweight title. Look at when Aljo said he might not be able to make the quick turnaround against O'Malley. Dana White said, fine, we'll make an interim belt then. So don't be shocked if they make it with no belt, but don't be shocked if also they make Israel Adesanya versus Khamzat Chimaev with an interim middleweight title fight. That would not be surprising whatsoever if the UFC did that in the middleweight division. Next up, and this is another kind of wild card title fight, that is Alex Pereira versus Khamzat Chimaev. Khamzat Chimaev, again, the UFC wants to build him into a star. The UFC wants him to be champion. If you don't remember, and I've said this in a million videos, when Khamzat was unranked, but he was getting a lot of attention from fans, the UFC tried to make him fight Leon Edwards, or tried to make Leon Edwards fight him to make Khamzat the #1 contender without really having to fight his way up the ranks. The UFC desperately wants Khamzat Chimaev in a title fight. It just hasn't worked out for whatever reasons. And right now, you look at the light heavyweight division, if Jamal Hill's having legal troubles for a while, or Jamal Hill's still injured for a while, Alex Pereira versus Khamzat Chimaev could be your UFC 300 main event. And guess what? The UFC is going to like the matchup stylistically for Khamzat Chimaev, because Khamzat has unbelievable grappling, wrestling, and submission skills. And that is Alex Pereira's biggest weakness, is his grappling and wrestling skills. So that is a fight that would be absolutely mind-blowing, but I think the UFC could throw that together. Pereira says he wants to stay active. Khamzat Chimaev even recently said he wants to fight at UFC 300. It makes kind of perfect sense in a weird way. And I'm not advocating or diminishing any of these fights, but if you look at it on paper and you look, if the UFC is really trying to find a UFC 300 title fight, it could be Pereira versus Chimaev. That would make perfect sense in terms of the, spectacle of what the UFC is looking to build for UFC 300. Next up, Conor McGregor versus Michael Chandler. That is a fight that's been talked about since February of 2023, and we're now talking about it potentially being booked for April of 2024. I think there's a strong possibility maybe the UFC finally says, you know what, we're going to make this fight. Chandler's really been begging us for it and begging us for it and begging us for it, and this is a big fight. I think the UFC could finally announce it for UFC 300. I know John Kavanaugh came out and said, oh, no, it's looking like that fight's going to happen in the summer. And I know Chandler's come out and said, oh, Conor McGregor's trying to wait me out, but I'll wait as long as possible. There's a chance Chandler gets screwed over and Conor never fights him. There's a very good chance of that. I've been a big proponent of saying that over and over and over again since February, when people were laughing at me that I said this fight would never happen. But I think when you look at the options for UFC 300 and the, kind of spectacle the UFC wants to have for UFC 300, I think Conor McGregor versus Michael Chandler makes a lot of sense. And there was a report of that fight being targeted for UFC 300. And then that's when Kavanaugh came out and said what he said. And that's when Dana said, oh, no, that's probably going to happen in the summer. The UFC doesn't like when people break news before they break news. So it could be one of those things where they're trying to throw you off their scent for UFC 300 so they can announce it and everyone can be shocked. That's what Dana White truly wants. Another matchup, and this is the second to last matchup that I have for UFC 300, is Conor McGregor versus Nate Diaz 3. I actually think this is more likely than Conor McGregor versus Michael Chandler, because Nate Diaz is being offered like 15 to 20 million to fight Jake Paul in PFL. He's turning that down for a reason. Well, what's a potential bigger fight that Nate Diaz could want? It's the Conor McGregor trilogy. Conor McGregor versus Nate Diaz would be massive. It checks all the boxes. This is a prediction that I've had, for a couple months. I've kind of teetered and tottered back and forth in terms of confidence. But the UFC, Conor McGregor wants a warm-up fight. He said, I want a tune-up fight. Nate Diaz, while it's not a guaranteed win, it's a much more manageable fight than Michael Chandler, who's in the gym every single day. And Conor McGregor versus Nate Diaz would be probably on this list in terms of scale and spectacle. I think McGregor versus Diaz 3 would be the biggest fight the UFC could make. And it gets Conor McGregor that tune-up fight. It brings Diaz back, who's already a proven UFC draw. and they put them two together, this is going to sell millions of pay-per-view buys, probably a million, 1.5 million, something along those lines. It's a huge fight, and it's the trilogy that everyone's kind of been hoping for many, many years. I'm kind of, you can throw cold water on it. I don't care anymore about this fight, but it's a fight that would get a lot of casuals drummed up and back into the sport and watching the fight card, and it's a fight that Conor McGregor can win. And at the end of the day, when you see the UFC kind of babying contenders up the ranks and giving them favorable matchups, that's the same thing they kind of like to do with stars, and that's what they're going to do with Conor McGregor. That's what they're going to do with him, and I just find it hard to believe they're going to book him against Michael Chandler, who is a freak athlete, who has brutal KO power. Don't get me wrong, it's a winnable fight for McGregor, but, I mean, what's more winnable? Michael Chandler or Nate Diaz in his current state, where he's kind of washed up, he's getting older, he just lost to a YouTube boxer. I think Conor McGregor versus Nate Diaz is a realistic option for UFC 300. And lastly, and this is a fight that I think's kind of just as likely as the Conor McGregor fight, or, Conor McGregor Diaz, or Conor McGregor versus Chandler, but that is George St. Pierre versus Nick Diaz. I know what you're thinking. That's a horrific fight. That is an absolute horrific fight. I'm right there with you. Nick Diaz hasn't won a fight since, I think, 2011, which is absolutely insane. His last win was all the way back in 2011. I mean, that is against BJ Penn. That's how long ago that was. BJ Penn. In his second stint in the UFC, Nick Diaz has only won one fight. His last fight, he literally quit against Robbie Lawler. There's been rumors of this fight for a while, and the rumors really started to up and up and up and kind of become, more people talking about it right around the time that Dana White is saying, oh, there's a super fight that popped up the other day and we're thinking about doing it. And just for novelty value, I think the UFC would do George St. Pierre versus Nick Diaz. I think there is a possibility to do that fight. I'm praying that it doesn't happen. I'm hoping that this fight doesn't come to fruition. On its head, it just seems like, when I first heard this, I'm like, no way this happens. There's no way. But nothing the UFC does would shock me anymore. And they'd be like, oh, well, George St. Pierre has a cult following. Nick Diaz has a cult following. And also, George St. Pierre's not going to come back unless it's a matchup he's pretty sure he's going to win. He cherry-picked that Michael Bisping middleweight title fight. So I really think there is a good possibility they could make George St. Pierre versus Nick Diaz as the UFC 300 headliner, which would be an absolutely disgusting headliner, and I'd be sickened if they made that. So for my prediction, first off, I believe one of these fights, I know I've gone through countless fights in this video, I believe one of these fights will definitely headline UFC 300. I think I've gone over really all the options. There may be more title fights if they add a title fight as a headliner. Let's say they do Pereira versus Hill or Hamzat as the headliner for a title fight. I think they would potentially throw some other title fights below it. Maybe a women's title fight. Maybe the Pantoja versus Royval winner. Maybe the Colby versus Leon Edwards winner could co-main. You could have like Alex Pereira versus Jamal Hill, co-headliner, Leon Edwards versus Bilal Muhammad 2, or Leon Edwards versus Shavkat Rakhmonov, or Colby Covington versus Bilal Muhammad. I think you could have that. But for my prediction, I think they're going to do at least two big fights. And the more I think about that George St. Pierre Nick Diaz fight, I just can't believe that they're going to headline it with that. So what the UFC is going to do, in my opinion, they're going to do Conor McGregor versus Nate Diaz 3 as the headliner, or Conor McGregor versus Michael Chandler as the headliner. Co-main event is going to be George St. Pierre versus Nick Diaz 2. And I think maybe the McGregor versus Chandler is more likely because I think the Diaz brothers have said they don't want to fight on the same card. But if they're getting paid millions of dollars and those are both massive fights for both of them, they might be willing to fight on the same card. So I think it's going to be somewhere along those lines, but I'll say it's going to be Conor McGregor in the headliner, and the co-main event is going to be George St. Pierre versus Nick Diaz, and then they'll stack out the card with some non-title fights below it, maybe Hamzat Chimaev versus Paulo Costa, something along those lines. They're going to stack UFC 300, but I just don't right now see a whole lot of great options in terms of title fights, and I've gone over all of them in this video. But let me know which of these fights that I mentioned are you most interested in, and what do you believe will be the UFC 300 main event? Let me know down in the comments. Don't forget to like the video. Don't forget to subscribe, and thank you so much for watching.